Good day. In my program yesterday, I discussed how I had read an article which spoke about the deepening gloom within the White House as the United States seems to be finding itself in a multitude of crises, all happening at the same time, with a general sense that the situation is getting out of control. I wasn't able to remember which article it was, and today I have found it, and it turns out that it was published by Axios. And it makes dramatic reading, and I'm going to read some parts of what it says. It says the following: never before have we talked to so many top government officials who in private are so worried about so many overseas conflicts at once. We don't like to sound dire, but to sound a siren of clinical, clear-eyed realism, US officials say this confluence of crises poses epic concern and historic danger. Behind the scenes, officials tell us that inside the White House, last week, in other words, was the heaviest, most chilling week since President Biden took office just over 1,000 days ago. And former Defense Secretary Bob Gates, who ran the Pentagon under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, tell us America is facing the most crises since World War II ended 78 years ago. He explains the White House's system overload like this. There's this gigantic funnel that sits over the table in the Situation Room, and all the problems in the world end up coming through that funnel to the same 8 or 10 people. There is a limit to the bandwidth those 8 or 10 people can have. Not one of the crises can be solved and checked off. All 5 could spiral into something much bigger. And then there is a list of the crises, and it is a most interesting list, and it is one that tells us a great deal about the perception of things within the United States government and the way in which the United States government, even these officials, perceive the world at the moment. So the lists include Israel's response, that's the first, five crises. Israel's response to the Hamas terrorist attack, that is one. The second is Vladimir Putin meeting in China this week with Xi Jinping to further strengthen their anti-America alliance. 3, a malicious Iran, and the article then tells us that within the United States it is taken for granted, the US government appears to be taken for granted that Iran was involved in orchestrating or assisting Hamas's terrorist attack, but officials seem that there's some uncertainty as to the extent of it, but officials seem certain that there are ties. 4th, there's North Korea and the actions of its leader, Kim Jong-un, who is described as unhinged. And 5th, there is disinformation, the spread of disinformation. Now, that is a very interesting list because, of course, it does not include the single biggest conflict of all, the conflict in Ukraine. I say the conflict of all, the biggest conflict of all. The conflict in the Middle East does have the ability to spiral out of control and to become even bigger and more dangerous still. But note that in this list, of the 5 crises that are all happening at one and the same time, Ukraine is not amongst them. Apparently, these officials do not include Ukraine as one of these crises. Now, that could be for one of 2 reasons. The first is that they don't think that the crisis in Ukraine is a particularly big or important crisis. They're not worried about the direction it is taking because they don't think it is terribly important. In other words, Ukraine has been relegated and has lost relevance. That's one possibility. The second possibility, which is, by the way, the one I tend to favour, is that the people who have been in touch with Axios, on the contrary, give Ukraine priority, the crisis in Ukraine priority. That remains for them the single most important and biggest crisis. It is the crisis they want to focus on, and they are unnerved and annoyed that all of these other crises are happening at the same time and are distracting them from the one crisis, the crisis in Ukraine, the crisis with Russia, which, as far as they are concerned, is the crisis that really matters. And that this might be the case, just go back and look at the 5 crises that we see being discussed. There's the crisis with Hamas, that's number 1. But then there's Putin's meeting with Xi Jinping, and that, of course, takes us straight to the heart of the Ukrainian crisis, the source of the Ukrainian crisis. The fact that Russia and China have been converging and forming what many Americans see as an anti-American alliance. And I've discussed previously how right at the start, when the administration was set up back in 2021, there appeared to be an internal debate within the administration between those who thought that China was the greater adversary, the mightier economic power, potentially the greater military power, and that what needed to be done, therefore, was to try to weaken China's overall position by trying to persuade the Russians to distance themselves from China by making concessions to Russia in Europe. That was one view, and it has once again been forcefully articulated by some of the people at the Council for Foreign Relations, by Thomas Graham, for example, in an article that he recently published in Foreign Affairs, and he's now published a follow-up article in, I believe, the National Interest, in which he goes into this in even further detail. He says that the United States needs to accept that Russia isn't going to go anywhere. Even if it is defeated in Ukraine, Russia will hold together. It will continue with much the same sort of government that it has now, with much the same sort of policies that it has now. Expectations or hopes of Russia's collapse are misguided. And he again says that America's priority should be to try to win the Russians over, to talk up the Russians, to talk up Russian fears of Russia becoming subordinated to China, and should try to persuade the Russians to distance themselves from China and ally instead with the United States. So that was one wing of the foreign policy establishment, and Thomas Graham's articles and the various moves that the various people in the Council for Foreign Relations have been taking to try to find an off-ramp out of the Ukrainian crisis show us that they're still there and that they're still active. But the other wing, the one led by people like Mr. Wes Mitchell, who wrote another article in the National Interest that in August 2021 that I've discussed many times, and which perhaps is also to be found, also has its support within the State Department, centred perhaps on people like Victoria Nuland and the wider community, perhaps, of neocons, if you like, based around the Kagan family. They took a diametrically different approach. They said it's important to try to break up this alliance between China and Russia, and that the way to do this, that's the one point where they agree with people like Thomas Graham, but they argue that the right way forward is not to make concessions to the Russians, but to defeat the Russians, specifically in Ukraine, or to trigger a crisis in Russia, and through that defeat to either break up the country, some of the more extreme elements think that, or in the alternative, to engineer the replacement of President Putin and his government with a more pliable government that will do the bidding of the United States and which will ally with the United States against China. In both cases, both the Thomas Graham wing and the Council with the Richard Haas, Thomas Graham wing, the Council for Foreign Relations people, who want to make some very, very minor concessions to the Russians, and the more hardline wing, people like Victoria Nuland and Mr. Wes Mitchell, both of them want to find some way of breaking the Chinese-Russian alliance. Both of them see Ukraine as key to this, but here there is a difference. The Haas-Graham wing want to make concessions to Russia over Ukraine, including conceding territory in Ukraine to Russia. The other wing, the Nuland Wes Mitchell wing, want, on the contrary, to defeat Russia in Ukraine. And we see that both wings are becoming worried that the opposite to what they want is happening. Instead of the Chinese and the Russians distancing themselves from each other, as they both want, the Chinese and the Russians, as the latest summit meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping confirmed, are converging and coming closer together. So that's the second big worry, perhaps ultimately the biggest worry of all. And then the third is that Iran is the great danger in the Middle East. They still are obsessed with Iran. And they still clearly want to find some means of breaking Iran or of defeating Iran. And then the fourth is North Korea. And here we come back to the issue of Ukraine, because the United States is convinced, perhaps correctly, I don't know, one way or the other, but the United States is convinced that North Korea is now shipping vast numbers of shells, 10 million shells by some estimates, to the Russians for use in the fighting in Ukraine, so that the Russians are not only outproducing the West in shell production, but they're now going to be supplemented with 10 million shells, which are being supplied to them by North Korea, which, if true, would put any hope of the West ever catching up with the Russian arsenal of shells completely beyond reach. And then lastly, As we said, there's the spread of disinformation, which again ultimately is principally blamed on the Russians. So we can see that for these people, for the people who've been talking to Axios, who are becoming so depressed and so worried, the conflict in Ukraine is still not seen for them as one of the great crises amongst the various crises that are happening. Rather, it remains for them their preferred field, their preferred place for geopolitical struggle. Both wings still see the conflict in Ukraine as the lever to detach China from Russia. One wants to make concessions to Russia in Ukraine on condition that Russia distance itself from China. The other wants to defeat Russia in Ukraine so as to cause regime change in Russia and to replace the current Russian government with a new Russian government, which will also break the alliance between China and Russia. So there we go. But let's go back to the sense of gloom, the sense that nothing is turning out right. All of these problems are coming together. The situation in the Middle East is spiraling out of control. Iran seems to be in the ascendant. There's fears about Hezbollah. The Axios article refers to all of that. And there's fears that Hezbollah might also become involved. And the Pentagon yesterday was talking about possible dangers to American troops who are spread out across the Middle East. And I discussed that also briefly. I touched on that also briefly in the Middle East, in my video yesterday. So what does the United States intend to do about this crisis in the Middle East? And the short answer is that we're told in the article that none of the crises, not one of the crises, can be solved and checked off. All five could spiral into something much bigger. And here we see the way that is happening, because there is much talk now, continued talk of an Israeli military operation in Gaza. Most people are sure that sooner or later it will happen. The United States, the president, has made an unqualified commitment to Israel, to support Israel. The US's European allies essentially have done the same thing. Middle East opinion is offended and angered by this, but it seems to be full steam ahead. There's no question from this Axios article of doing or of taking any action to try to solve this problem, perhaps through diplomacy or through talks. We are told, on the contrary, that the crisis cannot be solved and checked off. It's one of these crises that cannot be solved or checked off. So it's not seen as a crisis that is capable of political resolution. And the result is that the United States is following in Israel's wake. It has attached itself to the policy of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is under immense political pressure in Israel itself to take decisive action against Hamas, and the United States, therefore, unable to come up with any political answer, unable to proceed with talks, to try to broker talks, to call for ceasefires, to call for humanitarian pauses, as even Josep Borrell is now suggesting. The United States, therefore, the only thing it can do is reinforce its forces in the Middle East. And one US Navy carrier group is already in the Eastern Mediterranean. Another is apparently steaming in the same direction. There is talk that it is going to be redeployed now to the Red Sea, or rather will be deployed to the Red Sea, rather than to the Eastern Mediterranean. And by the way, if that is correct, then that will presumably either increase or reduce the amount of time it takes to deploy. I'm not sure whether this particular carrier, the Eisenhower, is based, whether it is from the west coast or the east coast. If it's steaming towards the conflict zone from the west coast, then presumably, if it is not going to go to the Eastern Mediterranean, that it will have to pass and circumnavigate Africa, so that will add some weeks to its deployment schedule. If, on the other hand, it is steaming to the conflict zone from the US East Coast, then presumably it will have to travel. Then the journey time will take less, will be shorter. I'm not sure whether these US Navy carriers are able to operate through the Panama Canal. I'm sure that there are lots of people who can answer these questions on the thread. But anyway, the word is that it's going to be deployed in the Red Sea rather than in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it is not difficult, by the way, to guess why. Putin gave that warning a couple of days ago that the Russians are deploying MiG-31 fighter jets equipped with Kinzhal hypersonic missiles to the Black Sea. And he pointedly said that if they are deployed in the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, where at least one carrier group is based, would be within range, which was, in my opinion, a clear hint that if there is any attack by these carrier groups on Russian forces in Syria, then the Russians have the ability, a reminder that the Russians have the ability to respond with hypersonic missiles against these carrier groups. So I think that was the explanation for the deployment to the Red Sea, the Eisenhower to the Red Sea. And that, of course, would put the Eisenhower out of range, apparently, of Kinzhal missiles launched towards launch from the Black Sea. I would say that I've seen it said that a carrier group in the Red Sea would, however, be within range of Kinzhal missile launches launched from MiG-31 fighter jets flying over the Caspian Sea. And of course, the Caspian Sea is an area where the Russians have historically, from which the Russians have historically frequently launched their long-range cruise missiles. So it's perhaps important to say that if American planners do think that they can put the Eisenhower in a place of safety by deploying it in the Red Sea, they might not be right about that. But there's also word that the United States is now thinking about rushing more Patriot missile systems and THAAD missile systems to the Gulf region, the Persian Gulf region, and the idea presumably would be to deploy them there so as to try to intercept these hypersonic missiles flying apparently at hypersonic altitudes at incredible speeds. But anyway, the hope is that you could use these missiles, these air defense missiles, to try to prevent these hypersonic missiles from reaching the carrier groups in the Red Sea and in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, all of that tells us how these American deployments, these American military deployments in the Middle East, are now escalating the situation. And as I said previously, in my previous video, Lloyd Austin is now giving warnings that if there's any attack on the Americans in any place, either these American troops dispersed across the Middle East, or, and I think his warning must extend to the warning previously given by Putin to the Russian hypersonic missile deployments. In fact, I suspect that it was triggered by it. Anyway, that Lloyd Austin is saying that in the event that there is an attack on the United States, on the US troops or US positions, the United States will, of course, mount an overwhelming, devastating response. So we see all of these military movements taking place as the United States finds itself deploying forces to the Middle East. And that brings us back to why there must be gathering alarm and gloom in the White House, because probably one of the reasons why the officials in Washington have not seen the crisis in Ukraine as one of the major crises that they need to be seriously worried about is because it is a conflict which the United States continues to wage through a proxy. That proxy is Ukraine. The United States has concluded that it can continue to wage this war against the Russians in Ukraine with little risk that the United States will be directly confronted, that it might come head to head with the Russians. But in this latest conflict in the Middle East, it turns out that that is not the situation at all. We see that the Russians are deploying their forces with their hypersonic missiles. The United States is forced to respond. It is having to redeploy apparently one of its carrier groups to the Red Sea, and it is having to deploy Patriot, more additional Patriot and THAAD missiles to the Middle East to counter the threat from those Russian hypersonic missiles. So it's not surprising that there are some people in Washington who are becoming increasingly alarmed by these developments. And of course, there are further causes of alarm, because even as the United States is busy deploying these huge forces to the Middle East, these huge naval forces, but it's also apparently sending fighter jets and ground attack aircraft, and it's also deploying ground troops. There's a Marine contingent, a contingent of American Marines being sent there, a brigade apparently, or at least part of a brigade. For the moment, it seems that the talk of deploying the 101st Airborne Division to Jordan, that doesn't seem to be happening, at least for the time being. Perhaps the Jordanians have pushed back, but it's quite likely that sooner or later it will be deployed in some form somewhere in this region. Even as the Americans are making all of these deployments, even as the Russians are responding with deployments of their own, the third superpower, China, is also making deployments as well. And the Chinese Navy is also sending its destroyers to the region. It's difficult, again, to get a full picture of exactly what these destroyer deployments by China amount to. Obviously, they're nothing like on the scale of the American naval deployments, but once more, and for the first time, we see that American military deployments in the Middle East are being mirrored, at least to some degree, by Chinese deployments. Now, again, I don't know what the decision-making process in Beijing is, what decisions the Chinese took about sending these warships. It may be that these warships were heading to the Middle East anyway, and that a decision had been made by China to deploy them there before this crisis arose. But of course, they are there, even if that is the case, or are heading there, even if that is the case. And it's very likely indeed that the Chinese and the Russian navies, and of course their respective political leaderships, are discussing these matters with each other. The Chinese and the Russian navies now regularly carry out joint exercises. The Chinese and the Russian naval commanders know each other well and have worked together. There is very tight liaison between the Chinese and Russian navies. And of course, there is very close liaison between the Chinese and Russian political leaderships. And of course, Putin was recently in Beijing, where he met with Xi Jinping. So all of this is taking place in the Middle East, even as this program is being made. And I am going to suggest that the single biggest explanation for these repeated delays in Israel mounting its ground offensive in Gaza, as well as the many other suggestions that many others have been making, including myself, the immense difficulties, the tremendous challenge that a ground operation in Gaza would represent, the worries that Israel might suffer heavy losses and that the fighting in Gaza might become protracted, the fear that there would be a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and that this might have a significant political effect both within the Middle East and to some extent in Europe and even in the United States itself. Over and above and on top of all of these factors, I'm going to suggest that one further reason why there has been a delay is because the United States has not yet completed its military deployments to the region. It wants to have overwhelming force in the region in order to cover for whatever action Israel is taking. It wants to have overwhelming force in the region, perhaps because it has other strategies beyond the ones that require the US to provide cover for Israel, given that officials are apparently taking it for granted that Iran had some role in this Hamas attack. Perhaps there is again some idea of an eventual strike against Iran. Who is to say? But anyway, it could be that the United States has told Israel, hold off until we have all our naval assets and our troops in place. And of course, these, what look increasingly like Russian and Chinese countermoves, might also be complicating and extending, prolonging both the deployments and the planning. Anyway, it is a very dangerous situation, and we can see why some people in Washington are becoming alarmed. What we are looking at is a potential superpower confrontation in the Middle East. No longer a proxy war like the one we've seen in Ukraine, which does not have the officials in the administration too concerned. We're looking at instead a straightforward superpower confrontation like the one we had in 1962 at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and potentially came very closer to having than people realize, at the time of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. It's not widely known that at the time of that conflict, the Soviets made military deployments which looked like they might be preparatory to direct Soviet intervention in that war. There were reports, I remember, circulating at the time about a Soviet airborne division having been deployed to Yugoslavia in preparation for a possible intervention in the Middle East on behalf of the Arab states. And of course, the United States was taking counteraction to try to neutralize those Soviet deployments. But all that happened at a time when the Soviets and the Americans had strong and reliable diplomatic channels that they could use with each other. So though there was a superpower confrontation at that time, there were reasons to think that it would not spiral out of control. This time, the relations between the various superpowers, the Americans on the one hand, and the Russians and the Chinese on the other, are much worse. The Americans aren't speaking to the Russians at all. The Russians don't want to speak to the Americans either. And relations between China and the United States at the present time are extremely bad. So it's not surprising, given all of these moves, these big moves, military moves and counter moves, these warnings made by the Russian president and by the US Defense Secretary, that there are people within the administration, within the US government, who are freaking out. And we also see how Bob Gates, the former US Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, he says that this is the most complicated and difficult crisis that the United States has faced since the end of the Second World War, 78 years ago. And he also says that the people who are making the decisions, the 8 to 10 people who matter, the President, his National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, almost certainly the Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, the head of the CIA, the head of the CIA, the Defense Secretary, all of them are currently facing systems overload. They're in a crisis where control is slipping and they don't fully know quite what to do. But note also the other bigger mission from this Axios article, because nowhere is it suggested that the US government should take political steps to try to resolve any one of these crises. I said how, at the time of the 1973 war in the Middle East, the Russians and the Americans were talking to each other. Henry Kissinger and the Soviet Foreign Minister of that time, Andrei Gromyko, were on good speaking terms. The president of that time, Richard Nixon, actually had a very good working relationship with the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. And there was lots of communications, lots of discussions. The Soviet ambassador in Washington at that period, Anatoly Dobrynin, was an extremely skilled diplomat who had often carried out negotiations, diplomacy on behalf of his government with the United States. He'd been used back at the time of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis to set up a back channel to the Kennedy administration. JFK and his officials communicated directly with the Kremlin through Dobrynin. And in 1973, Dobrynin was still there, and he was fulfilling the same role, this time for Nixon and Kissinger, as he did, by the way, for other presidents since then. Nothing like that exists today. If there are such back channels, we know nothing of them, and all the indications are that they do not exist, that there is no back channel between the White House and the Kremlin, and there is no back channel between the White House and Zhongnan High, the garden complex, the gigantic garden complex in Beijing, where Xi Jinping has his office. So there is none of that communication between the superpowers, and there is no ability at the moment, at the present time, to carry out diplomacy, conduct diplomacy with the leaders of those superpowers. And nor is there any ability to conduct diplomacy with Iran. Tony Blinken and the president himself went to the Middle East, as I've discussed in various programs. Blinken did visit a number of countries. He went to Egypt, where, as I said, he was lectured to and insulted by Egypt's president. He also, of course, visited other Arab countries. He ended up in Saudi Arabia. He had cold and unsatisfactory discussions with the Saudi leaders. But, of course, there was never any question of him going to Tehran, much less, of course, to Moscow or Beijing to discuss the crisis that was taking place there. And the president himself was never able to get beyond Israel. He was confined to Israel. The Jordanians refused to host that summit that had been set up for him with the Egyptians and the Palestinians. He wasn't able to hold that summit, and of course he too is unable to speak to the Russians or the Chinese. He's been trying to speak to both for ages, but they have little confidence or trust in him, and they're not speaking to him at the moment, and he's not able to discuss things with them, and he shows anyway little real understanding of wanting to. So, in the absence of diplomacy, with the sense that, to go back to what the Axios article says, that none of the crises can be solved or checked off, it seems to me that we are, one way or the other now, on an inexorable ride towards a major regional war in the Middle East. Huge US deployments, quite potentially with the real risk that the United States can become involved, at the very least, an Israeli ground operation in Gaza once these deployments have reached that position where the United States feels confident that the Israelis can finally move, and a sense that US officials, conscious of the enormous dangers of the tremendous forces that are now shaping in the Middle East, can do nothing more than cross their fingers and hope that nothing catastrophically goes wrong. I'm going to express here my opinion, which is that I do not think that anything will go catastrophically wrong, not because the danger that something might go wrong isn't there. These officials who are so worried about this are absolutely right to be worried. Rather, I think it will not go wrong because the Russians and the Chinese, in contrast to the much more foolhardy people in Washington, are disciplined and practical people. They do not want a regional war, provided the United States doesn't do something utterly reckless, like attack Russian forces in Syria. The Russians themselves will not move, nor will the Chinese. But of course, if there is a conflict with Iran, there's a greater potential for things escalating. But I think in the end, even that is perhaps rather less likely to happen. But anyway, I think that because of the discipline on the other side, we will probably avoid seeing the worst. And note again from this Axios article that the things that have been talked about, all those concerns about the effect of a long war in Gaza, the collapse of political support in the West, the prospects for a UN resolution unfavorable to the United States. It seems that the 8 or 10 people who are making the decisions, they're not able to think about that. They're not even thinking about it, even as they worry about the deteriorating military situation and are becoming increasingly nervous about the various moves which are being made. Well, I think that if they're not worried about a UN resolution, if they're not worried about movements, not just in world opinion, but also of opinion in the United States itself and in Europe, then they are being frankly unwise. First of all, I think they're underestimating the strength of feeling in the Middle East. I think many US officials have the belief that what the Arabs say, what Arab leaders say, is not to be taken seriously. They assume that all Arab leaders are totally and completely cynical, that the Arab street has spoken out many times, and that it can simply be disregarded. And there's reason why they might think that. There have been previous clashes in the Middle East, and Arab leaders have not been particularly fazed. I actually do think it is different this time. And the reason I think it is different this time is because the overall geopolitical situation, the global balance of power in the world has changed. I don't think that in the United States this has been fully understood. I have been reading some really remarkable articles which have been appearing in the US media, including one that I found particularly strange in Foreign Policy, one of these other big US foreign policy magazines, this one by Matthew Duss, in which it's assumed, for example, that the only reason that Saudi Arabia has made moves to join the BRICS and has sought a rapprochement with Iran is in order to gain leverage over the United States. That what the Saudis really want is not to be a member of the BRICS, not to distance themselves from the United States. They want instead to frighten the United States by making the United States think that Saudi Arabia is going to do all of these things, but that the Saudis, their ultimate game plan is to extract concessions from the Americans. And the idea is that if you do give the Saudis what they want, if you look the other way whilst they pursue a nuclear program, and I notice still that nobody's saying this, but to my mind, a nuclear program in Saudi Arabia can only ultimately mean Saudi acquisition of nuclear weapons. If you go ahead and give the Saudis further security guarantees from the United States, well, they will move away from China, they will move away from the BRICS, they will end their rapprochement with Iran, which American commentators all assume is not really intended seriously, that the Saudis fundamentally continue to be hostile to the Iranians as they have always been, and that they will re-embrace the United States. And after all the crises that we have at the moment, the US will be able to get from the Saudis all the things that the US wants, work to reduce the price of oil, and diplomatic relations between Israel and Riyadh. And in fact, American officials publicly are still talking in that way. US officials have been going out of their way over the last couple of hours to say that the process of Israel, Saudi Arabia normalization has not been thrown off course by this current crisis. It's still going to proceed. It's still the ultimate objective that the United States remains committed to. Now, as I said, cynicism about Arab leaders is historically extremely well-founded. They have played the United States before, but they've always ultimately come back to the US fold. So there is some reason to think that the Saudis might indeed be acting with exactly that kind of cynical motivation that these reports suggest. However, it's important to say that previously, historically, in the past, the Saudis had no real alternative but to forge close relations with the United States. The United States was the world's mightiest superpower. The other superpower in the past, the Soviet Union, was ideologically, fundamentally hostile to all the things that Saudi Arabia represented. The Saudis were very, very opposed to the left-wing socialist movements that were current in the Middle East at that time and which the Soviets were backing. And for that reason, the alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United States rested on extremely firm foundations. None of that applies anymore. The United States is not the only game in town. There is little economically or technologically that the United States can offer Saudi Arabia that the Chinese and the Russians can't, at the very least, match. Saudi Arabia sees no threat to itself from China or Russia, which do not have the kind of revolutionary leftist programs that the old Soviet Union once did. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, taking it from that article by John Helmer, the left, the secular socialist left in the Middle East, has all but disappeared. The only place where you will still find it to any degree is in Syria, where President Assad and his party, to some extent, still embody those ideals. So it's a completely different geopolitical environment, and the Saudis have choices that they didn't once have. I can remember how just a few years ago, not very long ago at all, subsequent to our setting up the Duran, whilst the Duran was still in existence, was already in existence, you could find articles in all sorts of publications and places which continued to insist that the Chinese-Russian rapprochement was not for real, that the Chinese and the Russians were still antagonistic to each other, that they were the best of frenemies, as a cover on The Economist put it, that there was no real reality or substance to the Chinese-Russian relationship. And today, I don't think anybody any longer believes that. And I personally would not be surprised if the United States is making the same mistakes about the shifts in Saudi policy that we're seeing at the moment. So I think that the underlying analysis of the situation in the Middle East is potentially very wrong. And I think that if there is a prolonged military crisis in Gaza, American assumptions that Arab opinion really doesn't matter, that the risks of a defeat for the United States, either in the Security Council or in the General Assembly, are being overstated. I think all of these ideas, if they do exist, are frankly complacent. But anyway, there we are. We shall see how events do develop over the next couple of days and weeks. I am now firmly of the view that there will be some kind of military operation. There are reports that yesterday, Israeli troops did enter Gaza, but on a relatively small scale. It said that the objective has been to obtain the release of the hostages. There's said to be around 200 of these held by Hamas. It's not clear where they're being held. Perhaps the Israelis have some ideas. There's reports that a German special forces unit from actually the German police rather than the military is being deployed to Cyprus, also potentially to be deployed to Gaza to try to obtain the release of these hostages. So some military moves of some sort of that nature are already underway. And of course the respective aerial and missile campaigns already continue. But I come back to my view. I think a military operation in Gaza by the Israeli military is now a certainty. And it will depend very much on discipline in Moscow and Beijing, and of course also in Tehran, if we're going to avoid this conflict getting dangerously out of control, because no one in Washington seems able to put down the brakes or to try to prevent that happening. Now, I have received some further commentaries from people who have been writing to me. I've had very interesting, thoughtful article by a particular person. As I said, I'm never going to name these people, but anyway, he's suggesting that there's misunderstandings about many people in the West may misunderstand the situation in the Middle East, and that the reason why Hamas has acted in the way that it has done is because it has sensed weakness on the part of Israel and the West, and that the only way, therefore, that the situation can be secured is through an overwhelming use of force against Hamas, and that is the only way in which security can be achieved. Well, I've seen that article, and that's that theory expressed many times. I have to say that I do have concerns. For one, if one follows the logic of that, then again that would suggest that the only way that Israel can achieve security in the region is by constant displays of overwhelming force, which I have to say looks to me a dangerous and unsustainable position. But then, of course, the other weakness in the argument is that it assumes that an overwhelming use of force in Gaza by Israel and the Western powers is actually going to result in some kind of victory. As has been pointed out by several people, by Brian Beletic, for example, in a recent program that he did on the new Atlas, all Hamas has to do in Gaza is survive as an organized force, whatever it is that Israel is prepared and the Western powers are prepared to do to it. If Hamas survives, then following this logic, the logic of this article, Hamas has won. And the perception in that case, not just on the part of Hamas, but across the Middle East, is that Israel is actually even weaker than it had appeared to be before the Hamas attack was launched, in which case that would attract the possibility of further attacks. Now, coming to that, there is, of course, a follow-up piece from this military person that I've spoken about who was unimpressed by Hamas fighters, and he does think that Israel would probably almost certainly prevail in a conflict against Hamas, and he's made comparisons between the fighting that might happen in Gaza and the Battle of Bakhmut, where, of course, the Russians eventually prevailed. I think this is an analogy that I would not press myself. I think that I can already see problems with it. Bakhmut was a town of 70,000 people before the current conflict in Ukraine. Gaza has a population of over 2 million. It's far more densely populated, far bigger place than Bakhmut is. The military operation that would have to be brought to bear in Gaza, to my mind, would have to be many times the scale of the one that we saw in Bakhmut. The operation in Bakhmut took months to achieve its result, and I wonder whether Israel has those months. I've already said that I think that there is complacencies about Arab opinion and about the moves of the Arab states. I think there's complacency about sentiment across the global south, or perhaps the global majority, as it should be more appropriately called, perhaps. We've already seen how ASEAN has come forward and made that statement, which I discussed in a recent program. So I think that a conflict in Gaza that goes on as long as the one in Bakhmut, or which goes on for less duration of time than the one in Bakhmut, will run into ever increasing political resistance around the world, and potentially also in Europe, and to some extent in the United States as well. And it might not be doable. And for the record, I saw that in his program yesterday, Brian Beletic on the New Atlas also said that there might be logistical impediments to that as well, that Israel's ability to produce shells is perhaps 100,000 shells a year, which would translate to 500 a day, which might not be enough. The United States is now overextended in terms of shell production because of the divergent calls coming from Ukraine. And whilst Israel probably has enough equipment and shells and material to conduct an offensive in Gaza for, say, 12 weeks, beyond that, logistical constraints might start to kick in. And if Israel hasn't established complete control of Gaza within those 12 weeks, then there might be difficulties about achieving it. Now, let me stress again, I don't know what, if any, plan Israel has, what intelligence Israel has about Hamas's tunnel network and bunker network, assuming it exists. I've taken with great notice what this military person has said about Hamas's levels of training and motivation. Perhaps they're not as skilled and tenacious and organized fighters as some think. It could be that this will turn out to be an easier operation than many suppose. But if it turns out otherwise, then immense political risks are being taken. And by the way, coming back to the earlier part of this program, given that we have a real potential for a superpower confrontation in the Middle East with these powerful deployments, not just by the United States, but by the adversary superpowers, China and Russia. Of course, the potential for a far bigger crisis is there. Anyway, as I hope is clear, I have come to the very, very depressed conclusion that one way or the other, there is now going to be a military campaign in Gaza. There have been warnings against it, warnings by many of Israel's friends, by people like Jonathan Friedland in the Guardian, Simon Tisdall in The Observer, Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times, all people who are viscerally hostile to Russia, for example, and very strongly supportive of Ukraine and strongly sympathetic to Israel as well, by the way. But none of that seems to be having any effect. There's complacency, or so it seems to me, about Arab and Muslim opinion. There's once again a failure to address the enormous shifts in the global balance of power. And, well, we're just going to have to wait and see what the results of the military campaign in Gaza are, and keep our fingers crossed and hope that there isn't an even bigger disaster involving the global superpowers and an extension of the war, and hope as well that whatever damage this campaign in Gaza, which is going to cause a humanitarian catastrophe, regardless of whatever other hopes we might have, anyway, that this campaign in Gaza does not spiral out of control. Well, that's what I wanted to say about the situation in the Middle East. There is that other war, the war that is going on in Ukraine. And there's been, again, a considerable amount of news about this. Over the last couple of hours, there's been suggestions that Ukrainian forces have been attempting to go back on the attack in various places, but especially in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. But the best, or at least the most reliable commentators on the Russian side seem to doubt that this has achieved any real results. There's still some uncertainty about the situation in Kherson region. But again, the consensus amongst the more reliable Russian commentators is that the Ukrainian troops have been pushed out of all of the villages that they tried to capture. They're not able to operate on these villages. There is some argument about whether there are any Ukrainian troops left on the east bank of the Dnieper at all. I think from what I've been able to glean that there probably are, but the numbers appear to be very small, and I get the sense that the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, for the moment at least, isn't achieving anything of any significance and continues to be, as I discussed previously, very underpowered. Now, yesterday there was another big Russian missile and drone strike across Ukraine. The Russians hit targets in Kiev, first time now for several weeks, and they also hit targets across the Black Sea. I noticed that one Russian commentator was reported by Slavyangrad as pointing out that the Ukrainians no longer seem to be quite as keen in claiming that they've shot down multiple Russian drones or missiles as they used to do. We used to get immediate responses from the Ukrainians that they've shot down large numbers of Russian cruise missiles. 90% of the cruise missiles launched allegedly had been shot down, even higher proportions of the drones. We're not hearing that so much anymore. And by contrast, if you believe what the Russians are saying, there seems to be a systematic destruction of what is left of the Ukrainian Air Force underway. Now, this is not attracting, in my opinion, the attention that it deserves, but I said that the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed, I think it was the day before yesterday, that over the course of the previous week, as many as 12 Ukrainian MiG-29 and Sukhoi-25 jets had been shot down by the Russian Air Force, and the Russians are continuing to claim that more MiG-29s and Sukhoi-25s are being shot down as well. Now, these are Russian claims, and I am unable to corroborate them. But what I have tended to find is that when the Russians do make claims of this nature, claims of material damage, as opposed to claims of human losses on Ukraine, those claims, after some weeks or months, tend to be corroborated from Western and Ukrainian sources. So I wonder what exactly is going on, why the Ukrainian Air Force, if these Russian claims are true, is suffering these very high losses at this particular time. Could it be that the Russian Air Force is becoming more aggressive? By the way, there are no reports from the Russian side of any Russian aircraft being shot down. Ukraine is claiming from time to time to have shot down Russian aircraft, but the Russians dispute this. And on this, by the way, I think the Russians are almost certainly correct. Well, could it be that the Russian Air Force is becoming more aggressive? Or could it be that with the changing balance on the battlefronts, with the Russians pushing harder in places like Avdeyevka and near Kupiansk, the Ukrainians feel that they have no alternative but to try to deploy their air force closer to the front lines? Well, I don't know. And again, because of the emphasis on what is happening in the Middle East, there is less discussion of military developments in Ukraine. And then, lastly, there is lots of contradictory information about what is taking place in Avdeyevka, about whether the Russians are making progress or, in fact, whether, on the contrary, they're being pushed back. Yesterday, Yuri Podolyaka, who is a Russian commentator, I will call him that, even though he comes originally from Sumy in Ukraine. Anyway, Yuri Podolyaka claimed that there was a major Ukrainian counterattack taking place against the southern pincer that is gradually working towards the envelopment of Avdeyevka. Subsequent reports, again these are from Russian sources, appear to confirm that there had indeed been such a counterattack. They all, however, seem to agree that the counterattack had ended up being unsuccessful. And again, over the course of yesterday, there were further reports that the Russians have now once again secured control of the slag heap, this giant piece of a hill of ash and soot and waste that is close to the Avdeyevka coking plant. If one believes some of the reports, this is the major object of the battle at this particular point in time. The Russians working very hard to try to consolidate control of this particular structure. The idea is that if they do and are able to put their artillery on top, or perhaps not their artillery exactly, but their forward observers, they will be able to shell the roads and railway links leading into Avdeyevka, gradually putting Avdeyevka under siege and choking off the Ukrainian defenders in Avdeyevka from supplies. Other reports, which seem to come more from Ukrainian sources, but which are reproduced in the West and which are backed by statements from President Zelensky, speak of the Ukrainians, however, holding their positions in Avdeyevka. Well, it's a very complex situation. The Ukrainian official in charge in Avdeyevka, I've noticed, seems to be publishing commentaries, which overall seem to be giving a much more pessimistic take on the situation in Avdeyevka than one is tending to get from officials in Kiev, Ukrainian officials in Kiev, and which we also see from Western media commentaries. So, intense battle going on in Avdeyevka, outcome unclear, status unclear. We do not have someone like Prigozhin giving us a running commentary. We do not have the kind of telegram channels that Prigozhin used to run when the battle for Bakhmut was underway, and which the Wagner organization used to run. It's much more difficult, therefore, to get a detailed picture of what is going on with the Russian Defense Ministry putting very tight restrictions indeed on the fight in Avdeyevka, about which, by the way, the Russian Defense Ministry itself, in its own intelligence updates, in its own briefings, is saying incredibly little. They have never confirmed that an offensive in Avdeyevka is even taking place. And there are also continued reports, as there have been now for many weeks, of further Russian pressure in and around Kupiansk. Now, let me reiterate again what my own personal view about all of these attacks, including the one in Avdeyevka, is all about. There's been much discussion about Avdeyevka's enormous strategic importance. It is widely acknowledged that it is the hinge point of Ukrainian defenses close to Donetsk city, that if Avdeyevka is captured, then the entire Ukrainian position in central and southern Donetsk region will begin progressively to collapse. And there's claims that Avdeyevka is strategically important in a way that Bakhmut supposedly was not. I disagree about the last. I think Bakhmut is indeed potentially very strategically important indeed. I discussed this extensively in previous programs. I think the capture of Bakhmut, if and when the Russians fully consolidate their control over the area, opens the way for further Russian advances in the north and central part of Donetsk region towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But I think that the purpose of the Russian offensive against Bakhmut last winter and the purpose of the Russian offensive against Avdeyevka this winter, this autumn and winter, is not to capture these places and exploit their strategic significance. It is to conduct attrition. Prigozhin admitted that his original instructions were not to capture Bakhmut, but to use Bakhmut to bleed the Ukrainian forces there, to carry out a meat grinder operation that would inflict unacceptable levels of attrition upon the Ukrainians. And Bakhmut was chosen because its strategic importance meant that the Ukrainians would be obliged to defend it, which is what the Russian High Command, of course, knew. And the Russian High Command did the same with the missile offensive it launched last year against Ukraine's energy system. I think that eventually the Russians probably will come after the Ukrainian energy system, just as eventually they will exploit the strategic advantages that they have gained through the capture of Bakhmut. But when they launched their offensive against the energy system last year, their purpose was not to knock it out, but to inflict attrition, to exhaust Ukraine's air defense system, which they have to a great extent managed to do. And I think Avdeyevka is the same. I think that in the case of Avdeyevka, the primary purpose of the Russians is the same as it was in Bakhmut last year. They realize that the Ukrainians have no alternative but to defend Avdeyevka. It is too important to the structure of their defense systems. So they are obliged to funnel more and more troops and more equipment, of which there is increasing shortages of both, to defend Avdeyevka, which is exactly what the Russians want to happen. Just as the Russians conducted Operation Bakhmut meat grinder last winter, so they are now conducting Operation Avdeyevka meat grinder this winter. Of course, Ukrainians will say that the Russians are suffering heavier losses in Avdeyevka than the Ukrainians are. They made the same claim about the fighting in Bakhmut. I didn't believe that about Bakhmut. I don't believe that about Avdeyevka either. But even if it were true, the Russians are in a much better position to absorb losses than the Ukrainians are. They have a much bigger population of young men, proportionately. Ukraine is now so short of young men that it is having to increasingly enlist women into the Ukrainian military, which is problematic for many reasons, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. And of course, the Russians have an enormous industrial base, which is now cranking out every conceivable weapon that the Russians need. I think I read somewhere that Russia is now making 100,000 drones a month, which it is deploying in the battle lines. And of course, if it's true that North Korea is sending 10 million shells to the Russians, well, we see how that situation is critical for the Ukrainians also. But anyway, the Russians can absorb losses far more effectively than the Ukrainians can. And they are going to use the Battle of Avdeyevka in exactly that way. And already I saw one Ukrainian Telegram channel, I think it was Resident, actually say that there is now concern within Zelensky's office that before very long, Ukraine is going to have to make a choice. Does it resist the pressure on Avdeyevka? Does it try to hold on to Avdeyevka and try to resist Russian efforts to encircle the town and the troops there, which would call for redeployments of Ukrainian forces from other parts of the battlefronts and final conclusive abandonment of the fiction of Ukraine's southern offensive? Or does it withdraw from Avdeyevka, leading to the kind of weakening of the battle lines in central and southern Donbass that I spoke about? So that is the dilemma that the Russians are seeking to pose to Ukraine. And can I say that in the case of Bakhmut, of course, the battle ended with the Russian capture of the town, and Arestovich, Zelensky's now alienated former spokesman, is now making statements which all but confirm that he eventually expects that Avdeyevka will be captured by the Russians also. However, we now know that Prigozhin actually exceeded his orders by working to capture Bakhmut, and that it was this that caused the collapse in his relations with the Russian Defense Ministry. I don't know what the orders the Russian forces that are being deployed to Avdeyevka are. Perhaps there is an order that they should capture that town, or perhaps the plan is to continue the attrition, and the actual capture of Avdeyevka is seen as somehow less important. I do not know the answers to those questions, but I think people should understand that those questions are there and that they are real. Brian Beletic has repeatedly made the correct point that the Russians are not fighting a battle for territory. They're fighting a battle of attrition. In a sense, Alex Christoforou and I said that on a live stream we did right at the beginning of this conflict, when we said that the objective the Russians would be pursuing in Ukraine would be the destruction of Ukraine's army rather than the capture of any individual town or city. So, I don't know what the Russians are planning to do, but of course, if they are able to consolidate control of the slag heap and are able to cut off supplies to the troops, the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka, then the attrition will become even more effective, and the Ukrainians will probably suffer the very losses that still suffer the losses, the attrition that I have said. Anyway, that is my summary of the situation in Ukraine today. I suspect that even if US officials in Washington want to think less about the Middle East, because for them, Project Ukraine still has priority, even if that is also what the president himself thinks. I think that the realities are that it is the situation in the Middle East that is going to become increasingly important over the next few weeks. I think we are in an exceptionally dangerous place. We will see what happens, but that will be a matter for further discussion in my next program. Thank you for joining me again. Just to remind you once more, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under the video. And don't forget to check out our shop where you can buy all the amazing things that you will find there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. This is where I end my video today. Wherever you are, stay safe and stay confident. I'm sure we will come through one way or the other. But in the meantime, as I said, this is where I end, and have a very good day until my next video.